the flight that landed with one passenger missing. The flight was completely normal. At least, that's what everyone thought. There was no turbulence, no emergency calls, no suspicious passengers, nothing unusual on the radar. But when the plane landed, one passenger was gone, and nobody could explain how. Not the crew, not airport security, not even the people sitting directly beside him. Because according to the passenger list, seat 18A was occupied for the entire flight. Yet when the aircraft doors opened, the man in 18A had vanished into thin air. And what investigators later discovered would turn this ordinary flight into one of aviation's strangest mysteries. It was a cold November evening in 1997 when Flight 702 departed from Chicago, headed for Seattle. The aircraft carried 63 passengers and 5 crew members. Most people on board were exhausted business travelers hoping to sleep through the 3-hour flight. Among them was a quiet man traveling alone. He checked in under the name Daniel Harper. Mid-40s, dark coat, black leather briefcase. Nothing about him stood out. Airport cameras captured him entering the terminal alone at 7:42 p.m. He bought coffee, read a newspaper, then boarded the aircraft without speaking to anyone. To everyone around him, he looked completely ordinary. But several passengers would later tell investigators something unsettling. They could barely remember his face. Not because they didn't see him, but because every time they tried to recall him, their memory became strangely blurry. One passenger described him as forgettable in an unnatural way. Another said she remembered looking directly at him during boarding, yet later couldn't even describe his hair color. At 8:16 p.m., Flight 702 took off, and for the first hour, everything seemed routine. Flight attendants served drinks. Passengers watched movies. Most of the cabin lights were dimmed. But then something strange happened. At exactly 9:03 p.m., a flight attendant named Karen made her first pass through the aisle near row 18, and she noticed seat 18A was empty. At first, she assumed the passenger was in the restroom, but minutes later, she walked past again. Still empty. The tray table was down. The coffee cup remained untouched, and the briefcase was still under the seat. Karen later said she felt uneasy immediately. Not because passengers leave seats all the time, but because something about the scene looked wrong, almost staged. She checked the restroom. Nobody inside. Then she quietly asked nearby passengers if they had seen the man from 18A. What happened next made the situation even stranger. The passengers sitting beside him claimed they never saw him leave. One man seated across the aisle insisted Daniel had been sitting there only moments earlier. Another passenger claimed he saw him staring out the window seconds before Karen arrived. But now, he was gone. No movement, no sound, no explanation. The crew assumed it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd moved seats. Maybe he was standing near the back. So the attendants searched the cabin carefully. Nothing. They checked every lavatory again. Nothing. Then the pilots were informed. And that's when panic quietly began spreading among the crew. Because there was one terrifying possibility nobody wanted to say out loud. The aircraft doors had never opened during flight, meaning there was nowhere he could have gone. The captain ordered a full cabin check. Passengers were asked to remain seated while crew members searched overhead compartments, storage areas, and every accessible section of the plane. Still nothing. No Daniel Harper. No sign of struggle. No note. Just an empty seat and a briefcase left behind. By the time Flight 702 landed in Seattle, law enforcement was already waiting on the runway. Passengers expected delays. Maybe questioning. What they didn't expect was the atmosphere that greeted them. Officers boarded the aircraft immediately. Federal agents interviewed every crew member separately, and the plane itself was treated almost like a crime scene. Investigators quickly focused on one impossible question. How does someone disappear from a sealed aircraft mid-flight? At first, authorities suspected suicide. Maybe he somehow opened an emergency exit. But that theory collapsed almost immediately. Modern aircraft doors cannot simply be opened mid-flight due to cabin pressure. And if someone had somehow forced one open, the explosive decompression would have been catastrophic. Every passenger on board would have known instantly. But nobody heard alarms. Nobody felt pressure changes. Nothing. Then investigators opened the briefcase. Inside were only 3 items: a paperback novel, a silver key, and a photograph. The photo showed Daniel standing beside another man in front of a lake cabin. But investigators noticed something disturbing immediately. The second man's face had been completely scratched out. Not torn. Not damaged accidentally. Deliberately scratched away. On the back of the photograph were 4 handwritten words. He should have disappeared instead. No one knew what it meant. And things became even darker when authorities discovered Daniel Harper didn't exist. The identification used to board the flight was fake. The address on file led to an abandoned building. The phone number was disconnected. Even the credit card used to purchase the ticket belonged to a man who had died 2 years earlier. It was as if the missing passenger had created himself solely for that flight, then vanished. Investigators spent months trying to identify him. Fingerprints revealed nothing. Facial recognition produced no matches. No family ever came forward. No missing person report matched his description. It was like searching for a ghost. But one detail continued haunting investigators more than anything else. Several passengers reported seeing Daniel after the disappearance. Not physically, but briefly, like reflections. One woman claimed she saw him standing at the very back of the cabin during landing, even though the area had already been searched. Another passenger said he glimpsed Daniel's face reflected in the dark airplane window long after seat 18A was empty. And Karen, the flight attendant who first noticed him missing, later quit flying entirely. Years afterward, during a private interview, she admitted something she had never told investigators. When she first walked past row 18 and saw the empty seat, she swore the window beside it was covered in condensation. And written into the fog with a finger were 3 words: "Not the right one." To this day, nobody knows exactly what happened on board Flight 702. There are theories, of course. Some believe Daniel was a fugitive escaping someone dangerous. Others think the disappearance was an elaborate hoax involving false identities and hidden compartments. And then there are the darker theories, the ones people whisper online late at night. Theories claiming Daniel Harper was never supposed to be on that plane at all, that someone else was meant to disappear, and somehow, something went wrong. Because according to official records, the seat beside Daniel's, seat 18B, had originally been booked by another passenger, a man named Michael Reeves. But Michael cancelled his ticket just hours before departure. Investigators later discovered something chilling. The scratched-out man in the photograph looked almost identical to him. And Michael Reeves died in a car accident 6 months later. Before his death, he reportedly told a friend something deeply unsettling. He said for months he'd had the same recurring nightmare. A nightmare where he boarded a plane, only to watch the passenger beside him slowly disappear during the flight. And just before waking up, the missing passenger would lean close and whisper, "You were supposed to be with me." Then Michael would wake up screaming. Still today, the disappearance of the passenger in seat 18A remains unsolved. No body was ever found. No identity was ever confirmed. And officially, Daniel Harper never existed. But somewhere in an evidence locker in Seattle, that photograph still remains. The face scratched away. The message still visible. And one question investigators could never answer. If the wrong passenger disappeared that night, then who or what was supposed to take his place? Like, comment, and subscribe for more at Raven Dossier's channel.